we'll all be together. Please feel free to jot questions down as they occur to you. We're going to pretty much stick to presentation for that first half, but if you have a thought, you have a clarification, you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and Oliver Lippy with Future Generations University will be monitoring the chat. So when we get to the Q&A, we'll start just in the order that they arrived in the chat box. So I think that's probably enough of the housekeeping. I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling with the presentation for this evening. So, as I said, my name is Anthony Flacavento. Dr. Kathy Kramer, who is at University of Madison, or excuse me, University of Wisconsin-Madison, is going to be tag teaming with me in this first part of a 4-part series. I want to start by just thanking our sponsors. The primary sponsor is Future Generations University, which I have the privilege to be involved with as both a board member and a part-time faculty at times. Future Generations is an interesting and unusual university in that it has grown out of literally decades of innovative community development practice all around the world, and built an academic program around what works to help more self-reliant and resilient local communities. So it's kind of the opposite of the ivory tower. And I'm just thrilled that they're have been willing to take on this series. They're joined by 2 other fabulous organizations, both of which are also very deeply involved in community development. Like College, started by Betsy Taylor, and LICAN stands for Livelihoods Knowledge Change Network. So a focus on bridging academic and intellectual resources with local knowledge towards establishing and strengthening local lives based out of Kentucky, but operating more widely. And then Appalachian Voices, which is throughout the Central Appalachian region. They have a marvelous presence in Southwest Virginia, where I am, and Appalachian Voices, an environmental organization that is also deeply engaged in economic transition away from environmentally destructive industries to the next better, healthier economy. So it's just really a privilege to have all 3 of them co-sponsored. I'll mention before I get into the presentation that this guidebook, which is something that I assembled about a year ago and we keep updating, is the place to go if you want to dive a little deeper than these presentations. It has about 36 articles by 20 terrific writers, activists, and it will really kind of put some meat on the bones of what you hear tonight and over the next 3 weeks. So I really do encourage you to look at that guidebook and start, deepening your understanding there. Now, as we begin, I have 4 little kind of context caveats that I want to say. And I've learned from experience of doing the webinar series that these things are pretty important. The first is that, although we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it specifically tonight, it goes without saying that racism and racial resentment are a major part of the divides in our country. It's fueling them, it's undergirding them, it's intensifying them. And there's no question that for many of us living in rural communities, or for those who are trying to understand rural communities, we have to accept that race and racism is a deep part of the history. But what I also want to convey is that it ain't just small towns and rural communities. It's not just the South. Race and the racism of our country is part of our history, the whole nation, all of us, North and South, urban and rural. And so we have to recognize that. And if you doubt that at all, I'd really encourage you to read any one or all of these 3 remarkable books in which the depth and breadth of race as a determining factor in our economy and our politics, our voting laws, our housing availability, our wealth accumulation, and so much more is documented in truly painful details. We're not going to spend a great deal of time talking about race per se, but we acknowledge that it is fundamental to this discussion. Second thing is that as we start down this path of trying to understand people who seem very different from us, who seem pissed off at us, whatever it is, we got to remember that our goal is to open some doors, to engage some people, not every. The point of this is not to minimize or accommodate hate or violence or any of those things, but to figure out how do we begin to build understanding, then empathy, and then with that understanding and empathy, begin to rebuild our bonds as neighbors, as fellow citizens. The third is that rural communities, no, are not all white. Many have long-standing populations of African Americans, and in some cases, Latinos and Native Americans. Those that have been historically white are generally increasing in ethnic and racial diversity. We recognize all of that. But it's also true that white rural people are the primary ones driving this divide that we're focused on. So that's where our focus is. And the last one, kind of growing out of the prior, is I'm going to ask you to walk and chew gum with me, because we've got to recognize that truly there is quite an exaggerated sense of grievance among a lot of folks in this country, and particularly in rural areas, and among rural working folks and conservatives. So it may be a greatly exaggerated sense of grievance. There are real and long-standing grievances folks have that, for the most part, haven't been addressed. The rage is often disproportionate, especially compared to what other people go through. Plenty of reasons for people to be pretty pissed off. And the white privilege that is part and parcel of being white in our society, it's there in rural communities. But many of the rural folks that we know, that I know, feel and see almost none of the trappings of privilege. They may be privileged in a number of respects, but it sure doesn't seem like it from the lives. So with those caveats, let's move forward. How did we get here? And tonight, we're going to focus on the first two of the 6 components. And the first underlying cause, I would say the foundational cause of our divide, is that our economy just hasn't worked for most Americans. We often talk about the 1%, but the truth is that the top 20% wage earners in our country have done really pretty well throughout this last 40-year period we're focused on. So that leaves 80%, or the vast majority of us, that haven't done so well. And these next 2 graphs illustrate. This shows the growth in the US population from 1980, the year Ronald Reagan was elected to his first term, until more or less now, 2016. Modest amount of growth from 230 million to 3.2 million, or excuse me, 320 million people. During that exact same period of time, this is how much the US economy grew, adjusted down for inflation. Now look at those 2 graphs again. That's the population growth. That's the growth in the economy. When we say the economy has grown almost threefold, we're talking about there's 3 times more money moving through our system, 3 times more transactions of services and goods, 3 times the wealth moving around. So if the population grew by just a modest amount, 42%, but the economy's nearly tripled in size, why aren't most of us a whole lot better off? And we know there's a lot of nuances to the answer, but the basic thing is because most of the new income that's been generated, not only in the 2009 to 2012 period, the first of Barack Obama's terms, but for the last 40 years, it's gone to the top. It's gone to Wall Street, where Wall Street employees, a relatively small group of people, made double in bonuses in 2014 what all minimum wage earners in this country made combined, leading to a situation where a handful of people have the equivalent wealth of the rest of us. So we can say that there's been this concentration of wealth, that wealth is in essence trickled up from labor to capital, meaning from workers to people who own the stuff, the factories, the land, the businesses, from Black families to white families, from small businesses and family farms to big corporations, from Main Street to Wall Street, and from rural to urban. So this wealth concentration has a definite direction. It isn't recent. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, with its extraordinarily steep cuts in corporate income tax and the top wage earner taxes certainly made this worse. And particularly after the corporations used their tax break to do things like major stock buybacks to enrich the CEOs and the main shareholders. But is that this process has been going on for 40 years through Democrats and Republicans alike. So we can't blame it all on the other side, whether you see yourself as a Democrat or Republican. I would have opinions about which party has better policies, but the fact of the matter is, on the Democratic side, from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama, there's been plenty of moves that have at least exacerbated, if not completely enabled, this shift in wealth, this concentration. Both political parties have contributed to it. Beyond the sort of general problems with the economy not meeting the needs of ordinary people, it's much worse in rural areas where since 2020, while small business development, that's what net new establishments means, has been fairly strong in metro areas, it's been essentially zero in rural areas. Another factor is that we have an economy in which a smaller and smaller number of big corporations reign supreme in multiple sectors, from the media to farm supplies. In rural areas, the concentration of the consolidation and concentration has a greater impact than in urban areas because urban economies are overall considerably more diverse. They're less dependent on one or two industries, one or two major employers than many rural communities. So that concentration, whether it's in meat processing like Tyson, whether it's in other industries, has a disproportionately negative impact on rural communities. And it leads to situations where farmers, in the case of the agricultural industries, are increasingly dependent on a handful of corporations, oftentimes to do things that a lot of suburban and urban consumers hate, like raising hogs and confinement. Claire Kellaway is a marvelous journalist. I'd encourage you to read her stuff. He put it this way, that farmers are caught between monopolized sellers and buyers. They have to pay increasing prices to the big boys who dominate the supply side, selling seed, fertilizer, et cetera. And then they turn around and sell to another small handful of giant agribusiness at a price that they can't control, that's dictated by them. So they're really squeezed. And that means that whether you're a farm worker like Lucas Benitez on the left, or a farmer like my Martin Miles on the right, you're looking at generally poor returns. Here's the deal, it isn't just agriculture. Not all rural communities are dominated by agriculture, but the problem is that it hasn't just been in agriculture, that many, if not most, of the kind of foundational rural industries and enterprises have seen this precipitous decline over the last 30 to 40 years. The timber industry losing 30,000 jobs in one decade alone, particularly out in the West and Pacific Northwest, but all over. Coal mining jobs, again, primarily in Appalachia, dropping in half in an 8-year period from 2012 to 2020. That came after 40 years of steady decline. And many, many other things like furniture manufacturers, textile plants that got offshored. So the cumulative impact is that if you're in a small town or a rural county or community that has been historically pretty dependent on a few employers in one or two industrial sectors or one or two business sectors, and those sectors go down for whatever set of reasons, a lack of any force entrustment, investor-friendly trade policy, whatever you want to name, then they take the towns down with them because of the lack of economic diversity. These ancillary businesses that might have been providing services, repairs, equipment, raw materials, they also are impacted, oftentimes closing up shop. Then tax contributions decline from all those employers that are either downsizing or shutting down. And although some people in those rural communities may still have half decent income from retirement or Social Security or something else, what they see is that their whole communities are shifting and declining. And so this leads us to the second cause, and I'm going to introduce Kathy in just a moment, which this widespread anger against elites. My suggestion to you from my experience in reading is that This economic malaise, the economic abandonment, and the economic insecurity that so many rural people face basically creates the conditions and the foundation for this overwhelming resentment. So, Kathy, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Anthony. So it's great to be with you all this evening. So you can go to the next slide, which is just a map of Wisconsin, where I'm from. I want to just start off by giving you a lay of the land here. This map is just showing you the portions of the state that are urban and the portions that are rural. Rural is green, urban is blue. So a big takeaway is a lot of the state is quite rural. And the larger blue area in the bottom right corner, the southeast corner, is the Milwaukee metropolitan area. And then just to the west of that is the Madison metropolitan area. That's where I live and work. That's the state capital and the home of flagship public university. Over in Minnesota, over to the west, that's the big blue blob there is the Twin Cities metro area. And to the south of the state is the smaller blue blob is Rockford metropolitan area, and then Chicagoland over on the eastern part of the state. So thanks. You can tell probably already from my accent that I grew up in Wisconsin, but I grew up, and back in 2007, I had just earned tenure at my university and was able to start out on a project that I'd been wanting to do my whole career, which was to study public opinion in the great state of Wisconsin, the state that I love, by driving around and inviting myself into conversation with people. I have throughout my career studied public opinion this way. I find it very useful to listen to the way people talk about politics. It helps me understand what tools they're using. And it also helps me see how their identity is working, how they think of themselves, how they place themselves in the world. And back in 2007, I was really interested in how social class identity matters for the way people make politics. And by that, I just mean where people see themselves in the pecking order of things in terms of status and how that influences how they feel and think about politics. And so what I did was to sample these dots, these communities across the state. I can tell you more about how I did that, but basically I was looking for a broad range of places through the state, small places, big places, urban places, rural places, suburban places, because I thought that I was going to get a wide range of people with respect to social class background. I tell you that because I was not looking for a rural versus urban divide. I didn't know it existed. And even though I had lived most of my life in the state of Wisconsin and thought that I was a small town girl, I learned pretty quickly that my town in which I grew up was 10,000 people, 8,000 people by the time I graduated from high school. That's not small town Wisconsin. So I started off in 2007 driving around the state, inviting myself into conversations of people who were meeting of their own volition in gas stations and diners and places of worship, what have you. They were just groups of regulars. And I basically, most of the time, was cold calling, just inviting myself in and asking people, I study public opinion. I'm really interested in who you all are and what your concerns are. So what are the big concerns around here? And we would go from there. And it was, as you will soon see, it was fascinating and very eye-opening. And I went back to these different communities. There were, in some of the communities, I spent time with multiple groups, but went back multiple times over a 5-6 year time span. And in the intervening years, since about 2012, I've been back to some of these groups. At 2012, I sort of had to stop doing my field work, start writing my book. But like I said, I've stayed in touch with some of these groups, and I can reflect a bit on more current attitudes if you'd like me to in the Q&A. But about a year in, it was pretty clear that what I was hearing in the rural communities was super eye-opening for me. Again, I wasn't looking for it, but what I was hearing in the rural communities, in the smaller towns, was this sense of people identifying as a rural person, but not saying I identify as a rural person. Instead, they were saying things like, people around here, people like us. They had this sense that people like them, places like their towns, were just not getting their fair share. They weren't getting their fair share in three main ways. They weren't getting their share with respect to power or decision making. They perceived that, all the decisions were made in the cities and communicated out to them, that there was little listening going on in reverse. So that's the first way in which they were getting the short end of the stick. The second way was in terms of money or resources. They thought that, all of our taxpayer dollars get sucked in by Madison, the state capital, and spent on itself or on Milwaukee, and we don't see that money in return. So they thought there was kind of an abuse of resources. They also perceived that all the wealth was in the cities, that the good jobs with benefits were in the cities. And so again, they felt like in terms of resources and money, they weren't getting their fair share again and being left behind. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they also felt like they weren't getting their fair share of respect. They were saying things to me in various ways. The people making the decisions that affect our lives, they don't know us. They don't understand what it's like to live in a place like this. They think we're uneducated and unsophisticated and racist and sexist and homophobic, Islamophobic. And, they actually just don't even like us. So that's what I call rural consciousness. That's that social sciencey term in the subtitle of my book. It's basically this sense that, us rural folks, we're not getting what we deserve. So you can go to the next slide, Anthony. So I called this resentment. I called it the politics of resentment because it wasn't, when it was expressed to me, it wasn't anger most of the time. It was more like this back burner, simmering sentiment that had probably there for many, many years. And it struck me as very important politically because there were so many layers to it. And these layers are what you see on the slide here. So it was this resentment towards cities and city people. It was resentment toward elites, lefty elites more specifically, but urban elites generally, toward the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party. Although mind you, most folks, when I push them and ask, which party do you think best represents people around here? Without skipping a beat, they would typically say, well, neither party is listening to people like us or representing people like us. But the resentment towards cities and elites and Democrats, it was also resentment toward people like me, people with cushy desk jobs, right? Professionals working in the cities who hardly ever work with our hands, or we hire people to do the hard work for us. And it was also racism at times. It was also resentment towards people of color. I put this bullet point last, not because it's less important, as you can tell from Anthony's remarks earlier, but because I want you to notice all the other layers to it too. In my mind, the racism is so powerful when it's invoked by political entrepreneurs, shall we say, or politicians, because it can ignite all these other resentments when it's tapped into. So this is why I thought it sounded politically really important to me, because with all these different layers, someone campaigning, someone trying to appeal to rural folks can tap into any one of these resentments and activate the others. So you can go to the next slide, Anthony. It seemed really like really fertile ground to me. And as you'll soon hear, as I explain this, you'll see that it was in fact pretty fertile ground in the state of Wisconsin as it was in many places around the country. So fertile ground for divisive messages, because people were saying to me in various ways, we're working really hard. We're working really hard. We're doing things the way we think we're supposed to, and we can't get ahead. And we deserve more. We think we deserve more. And it seems to us that what we deserve is going to people who aren't working as hard, who aren't as deserving. And Anthony, next slide here. When we think about perceptions of who work hard, I think it's really important at this moment in our economy, because people are perceiving that, real work is when you come home at the end of the day and you have to take a shower. Like you've been working so hard that you have to clean up, as opposed to, those city folks with the desk jobs, they take a shower before they go to work, right? And then people would ask me, Kathy, when do you take a shower? Because they were very intrigued with my job, right? They were very intrigued with, so you're a full-time professor at the public university to which our taxpayer dollars go. And here you are driving around the state and having coffee with people. How is that hard work? Right? And so this notion of like, who are you people? Like the stuff you make is ideas. How is it that you, public employee, have health care? How is it that you have a pension and you have a pretty high salary? And one thing that was really illuminating to me was the resentment that people expressed toward public school teachers, who in many respects people love, right, and have personal attachments to through their kids. At the same time, in many of these smaller communities, it is public school teachers who are earning the highest salaries in the community. And before Obamacare, they were the ones with health care and they were the ones with pension. So you could see the way in which, yes, people might have a personal attachment to a public school teacher from their own past or through their kids, but themselves were a bit resentful of the way their hard-earned taxpayer dollars were going to pay for public school teachers. So another way in which these sentiments were fertile ground for divisive messages is that there was this sense, like Anthony mentioned earlier, that their communities were dying and there was this sense of loss, that something was being taken away from them, including their own status, their own, the respect that they felt that they earned by working so hard, but didn't see respected in popular media or in the news media. You can go to the next slide, Anthony. And finally, you can see this, you can see this a bit in my comments already about public employees, but it seemed to me to be pretty fertile ground for arguments against government, right? Because people were looking around their communities and saying to me things like, look around my community, Kathy, and tell me that whatever government has been doing is working for people like us. It's not working, right? And they also perceived, again, that, government was being run by people who didn't listen to people like them, people in their communities, and was being run by people who actually didn't even like people like them. And there was also this that government was an urban entity, even though in the state of Wisconsin, about 10% of the workforce in any community on average are public employees. People perceived, for example, with public school teachers, they perceived that even if those folks had lived in their for decades, the way they were doing their jobs was being driven by decisions made in cities by primarily urban people. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So, as I foreshadowed a few moments ago, it did turn out to be politically very important in the state of Wisconsin. On the left here, you can see a picture of Scott Walker from time ago when he was running for governor in 2010. When Scott Walker, a Republican, ran for governor, he was Milwaukee County executive. He basically was running against the city of Milwaukee. He was saying that I, as county executive, was able to combat the Milwaukee machine. And he was also very much appealing to people in smaller communities around the state in various ways by refusing to take federal dollars for a train line that would run between Milwaukee and Madison, and also in the way he was portraying public employees as the haves and the rest of the workforce as the have-nots. So the here of the large crowd of people was the picture of one of the days of protest that happened when Scott Walker took office. Shortly after that, he proposed a budget repair bill that basically undercut public employee unions in the state. The result was a huge outcry, huge protests, that centered at the state capitol. But the state was very evenly divided on this issue because many of the people outside of Madison and outside of Milwaukee were saying, it's about time. It's about time that those public employees pay in more of their fair share, because we resent that we have to pay for their high salaries and their pensions and their health care. Forward the slide, Anthony. Oh, one thing I want to say, is Wisconsin was a bellwether state because the way these sentiments underpin support for Donald Trump as well. So when Scott Walker tapped into these sentiments, I mean, he was a very different politician than Donald is a very different politician than Donald Trump. But in their own way, they were both saying to people, you're right to be so upset. You're right to be so upset. You do deserve more, and vote for me and I will take care of it. Because for Scott Walker, he said, you know, he was placing the blame on public employees. Donald Trump's target of blame was different, people of color, immigrants, Muslims, but they were both giving people a storyline for blaming urban entities and sort of validating the anger or resentment that they were feeling. So thank you for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful, Kathy. Thank you so much. It's just great. I've been quoting for a couple of years now, but it's really nice to have the person herself here. So I think we're wide open now for about 25 minutes of discussion. Oliver, I know you've been looking at the chat box. Can you identify a question or two to get the conversation going? And folks, please keep putting them in the chat box.
Sure, yeah, there's a question from Chris about the research that you were doing, Kathy, so more directed towards you, about whether or not, so it says more people live in cities and need more resources. Was this accounted for in the methods? As in, did you talk to more people in cities than in rural areas to account for your research?
I didn't account for it that way, but what I did was turn to statistics and survey data to give me a sense of whether what I was hearing in my own, you know, driving around the state was representative of sentiments across the state as a whole. So the survey data did represent that there was a particular kind of rural resentment going on. But I think, if I'm reading this right, what your question is getting at is, isn't it, why are they complaining? Because cities need more money, right, to run things, for the fact that, or to account for the fact that more people live there. Well, I'm going to complicate your perception a little bit by saying it is, at least according to 2010 government expenditure data, it is the case that more rural communities, rural counties, so on a county basis, get more than their fair share of state and federal taxpayer dollars. If you're looking at the number of people that live in place and the amount of money they pay in taxes and the amount that they get back. However, it is also the case that there's higher poverty in our rural counties. There's higher unemployment and lower household income. And so it's complicated, right? To what extent we do spend more money in rural areas as a society in Wisconsin than we do on urban areas. And yet they have some pretty distinctive economic challenges. The other thing I would suggest is people in rural areas don't see my charts, right? Don't see these calculations of like the fair share that they're getting of taxpayer dollars. Instead, they see their communities like boarded up main streets, right? And they also see wealth passing through their community. If they're a tourist community, they see people with wealth, and they recognize that those folks are oftentimes from the cities, whether it's Chicago or Madison or Milwaukee or the Twin Cities, depending on where you are in the state. And So I guess all that is to say, you have to take into account of how they're seeing the world.
Got another one, Oliver?
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. Well put. So another question from Chris as well. And I'll just read out the whole comment. So it says these narratives were weaponized in the last few years, and the protests in Wisconsin last summer, some of the worst in terms of state violence toward protesters, and then culminated with the involvement of rural white supremacists like Kyle Rittenhouse. So the question is, how has this assessment been updated?
I stick by everything I just told you. I mean, I've been learning as I go along. I think the question is, isn't racism more of a force than I say here? So I guess my response to that is, I do want you to take away that racism is a huge force in what I'm saying here. What I don't want to get obscured is the way it is so interwoven with people's perceptions of who works hard and how deserving they are and who's to blame, and the way urban elites are in cahoots with people of color, for example. And by urban elites, I include elite people of color as well as white urban elites. That's what I was saying when I said that resentment's so powerful because of all these layers, because you can be targeting the Democratic Party and you're also igniting for people, BIPOC communities, right? You can be targeting lefty elites and you're also igniting resentments toward Democrats. So I don't want you to hear me saying white supremacy and racism is not at work here. What I want you to see is that it is at work, and it's especially powerful because of the way it's woven with people's sense of deservingness and work and their economic hardships.
And I'm going to add one thing to that, which is that this, I didn't say it at the outset, I probably should have with all my other little contextual comments, but this whole series takes as a given the work of Alex Jones and Breitbart and Fox News, the online sources, to create a narrative, to sway people, to gin up the sense of grievance and outrage and all of that. There's been a masterful, sustained effort for a couple, 3 decades now in that way. This is not to deny the importance of that misinformation and the disinformation. It's to say, let's figure out where, putting those things aside, where do we fit? If we consider ourselves a liberal or progressive person, an urban person, somebody who wants to do good in the world, maybe where have we been missing the understanding and contributing to the problem? Go ahead, Oliver.
Yeah, so this one's from Erica. So the question was, did people who bought into Walker's blame narrative wind up disillusioned with him, or they think that he did things that made their lives better, or that he exacted revenge on people they resent?
Can you say that one more time? I was trying to read a
Sure.
message to me in the chat, and so I missed the first part.
Yeah. So the people who bought into Walker's blame narrative, did they wind up disillusioned with him, or did they think that he did things that made their lives better, or that he exacted revenge on the people they resent? So essentially, what was the perception of the people who bought into that narrative?
We really didn't see support for Walker shift much in the state until he ran for president. And it was at that point when his support really started to decline in many of these communities. And so it really wasn't related to, apparently wasn't related to an assessment of whether he was delivering goods to them in a way, like delivering on a material level, but instead what they perceived was he is not spending time on us. He's not spending his time on the state of Wisconsin. He's pursuing his own political career. So I should add to that by saying that's a common dynamic in public opinion, right? Where people, their assessment of politicians, even as they're talking about these folks, as they're talking occasionally about policy and whether they think people stand for people like them, their assessment is often along the lines of identity much more than actual like material benefits or returns to them. And I was just sitting on a dissertation committee this morning on a young scholar by the name of Michael Shepard, who's at Vanderbilt University, has just finished a study of rural resentment across the country and looking at people's assessments of Donald Trump, especially with respect to healthcare policy, and showing pretty clear evidence in places where the rural health context declined those are places where support for Donald Trump increased between 2016 and 2020. And part of that story, I think, is the lack of information that people have to help them translate how what politicians are doing impacts their own specific community. A lack of information, I mean the decimation of state and local news media, and that there's no reason to expect that trend to turn around anytime soon. It's often it's difficult for people to make sense of, is this person really helping my community?
Thanks, Kathy. Next is from Stephen. It says, what did rural residents want for their children?
Oh, great question. It's complicated, right? Because, for example, here I am, a university professor, and so coming into their conversations, right? And oftentimes the conversation then would go to education, which was really useful for me to understand their perceptions of power and education and race and deservingness. And those conversations would all often take the following pattern, where people would be super proud of their kid who got into University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin, and so proud of what they were doing in big cities. And at the same time, just sad as all heck that they knew coming back because there weren't jobs, well-paying jobs with benefits for kids like their own. And so at the same time, they wanted for their kids to succeed and leave, prosperous, happy, content lives. They also wanted their kids to come back, but knew for the most part that.
This one's from Mary. It says, how can we address the economic structure that has any and all with pensions, especially rank and file, public works folks, but really everyone expecting Social Security, make us dependent on corporations, Wall Street to succeed?
I'm not sure if I entirely get the question, but here's what I would comment. We have two things that have contributed, I think, to people. I mean, when you think about people resenting public school teachers, and my wife taught public school for 31 years, they don't make a whole lot of money. So how did we get to a point that somebody with very modest incomes, who works really hard, who's seen their health insurance, go way up in cost, how do you resent somebody like that? It's hard to imagine. But I'd say there's two strands. One is that rural union jobs, which varied very much from one part of the country to the next, but generally declined dramatically. Now, in some places, not as much, but certainly in Appalachia, the decline of the United workers, where there's a lot of retirees still in the UMWA, but basically all mining jobs are now non-union. We've seen it in the steel industry. We've seen it in lots of places. So that sense of workers deserving basic things like paid vacation and sick leave and pensions has, I think, eroded as unions have been undermined by public policy and a lot of other things. So folks no longer think of that as basic. Now it's like a perk. Now it's like, who are you to have that? That's one factor. The other is, I think that we've all seen small businesses and rural communities, as I said, were never as economically diverse as urban communities, but there was historically a more of a base of small businesses funded by community banks oftentimes. And those small businesses, wages varied in what they, but generally speaking, they gave people a reasonably good living. And in those also crushed, we've seen community banks absorbed by the thousands into banks and shuttered. And we've seen, mom and pop businesses and family farms also. So that other thing that people had to rely on to kind of build a nest egg to develop some wealth has also been really systematically degraded, as union jobs with bigger companies have as well. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but that's the comment I would make on that.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. There's another question here, I think directed more towards Kathy about, so it says, it's great, this is from Shane, it's great to hear some of the differences and perspectives you found, but I'm interested if you found any overlapping or shared perspectives that were universal between urban and rural respondents. And before you answer that, I want to say I'm going to drop in the chat a link to a resource called Padlet, which will be available to you if there's any follow-up questions that we don't have time for, we don't quite get to within this webinar. So you'll be able to ask that there, as well as document like a takeaway you may have from the webinar. So I'll drop that in the chat in a moment. And then Kathy, do you want me to reread that question?
No, I think I got it, but
Cool.
jump back in. You think I'm not answering it right, Oliver? The thing that comes first to mind is people's sense of distance from both political parties. I received similar answers to that question, regardless of where I was at in the state. Sometimes even when I was talking with people who were themselves elected officials, I would ask people, which party do you think best represents people around here? And people would almost always say, well, neither party. That I have to say that shifted, the sentiment there shifted a bit depending on kind of apparent income level. So among more groups of professionals in the cities, whether we're talking Madison or Milwaukee or some of the smaller cities like Cross or Wausau, people say something along those lines, but then also convey that they were themselves thinking about running, and because if they got in there, they could do things right and they could represent people. But I didn't hear that among lower income people.
And I'll add to that in Jennifer Silva's book, and Jennifer and Kathy made a presentation to a group of us a few weeks back, her book, which looks at southwestern Pennsylvania, an old anthracite coal mining region, she found among the white residents who'd been there for generations and the newcomers, as she called them, who were often Latino or African American, that while they had very different perspectives on lots of things, one thing they had in common was a complete withdrawal from the political process, essentially a giving up on any hope. And Jennifer even said that when she voted and had her "I voted" sticker on the 2020 election, she was ridiculed by people for that, because to them, the political process had become so corrupt and so meaningless to their lives that voting was like a foolish act. Why would you bother? So again, some similar to what Kathy about Wisconsin.
A similar question in a way, Kathy and Anthony. It's It's from Stephanie. How much did your assessment address consistencies between rural and urban communities, specifically those that would fall within the category of those that do real work? So real work in the city and real work in the rural setting.
Well, yeah, I guess my answer is kind of the same there, but I think it's also notable that people doing manual labor um, often kind of lamented a time when, regardless of where they were in the state, lamented a time in which someone doing a job like theirs was kind of guaranteed a good life. People would often tell me that um, stories about how, you know, like my I I'm working in the factory my dad worked in, and or I used to work in the factory my dad worked in, and you know, when I was growing up, it was known you got a job there and you could get a boat, you could retire, you could go on vacations, and just look at how things have changed. And um, so I think there is a lot of sort of common perception of that experience across geography. And yet the folks in rural places perceived that their communities in particular had been the hardest hit economically. They weren't quite sure what had hit them, but they were pretty sure that they had it worse off than folks in the cities.
And I'll just add that in my experience in Southwest Virginia, primarily in Eastern Kentucky as well, it's not that rural working folks can't relate to or can't be, steered towards being basically class solidarity of feeling like a connection to people who bust their butts in the city. What they do, people who work hard and have kind of seen their fortunes decline. There's not a lack of that, but there is a sense that most of the elites who they don't like do live in the city and control the cities and control the narrative and everything else. So I think there is potential, and a lot of folks are working on this to try to connect people across kind of class and occupation and find the commonality. And I think there's good hope in that. We'll talk about that later on. But I think in general, when rural people think of cities, they don't think of the working people in cities primarily. They think of the educated elites.
Great. This question is from Matt. And paraphrase is just saying that I think Matt's seen a similar trend in the anger from urban progressives, particularly BIPOC folk, towards rural people, rural whites specifically. And sort of the question in there is whether you think, and a lot of this has been in the wake of COVID and in the last couple of years, so whether you think part of this has been because of COVID and George Floyd's murder and Trump. So are these things within the last couple of years fueling a rise in a negative attitude from urban to rural?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that as somebody who's run for Congress a couple of times. I can imagine that each of those played a role, but I think that this simmering anger and kind of contempt on the left, among the more elite class, educationally and politically elite class, has been growing for quite some time. And I think there is the whole reason I'm doing this work series is to try to confront that how have we also contributed that? Because I hear it a lot. I hear it from a lot of good liberal suburban and urban folks, and even some good liberal country folks who are just fed up. They're done with these people. They just feel like, they have the worst possible analysis of who they are, and they can't even abide the notion of somebody asking them to understand why folks feel the way they do. vote the way they do. They've run out of options. And yet we've actually extended ourselves, in my opinion, very well and not very consistently for not very long in trying to understand the differences between uh, both class and geography. So yeah, I think there's been a rise, but I think it's been going on for more like 8 to 10 years, kind of this intensifying giving up on these rubes in the country is kind of a common sentiment that you hear. When we get into the third session, particularly the third session, we'll get into the details with Erica Edelson about some of the language drives that from coming from the left and from urban elites.
This one's from Al. How much do you think the local perceptions of economic decline have been caused by consolidation of farm income, reducing the number of well-to-do people in the country, which might also undermine civic efforts?
Oh, I think that's a huge part of it. Absolutely, yeah. When you say the consolidation of farm income, Al, I assume you're also meaning the consolidation of farm businesses, because when you have a community that's had a lot of farms, a lot of businesses that feed into, support, provide materials or other things for farms, as one example, and then over a period of 30 or 40 years, the farms get fewer and bigger in dramatic numbers. The suppliers and the buyers and the retailers get far fewer and far bigger. Then speaking, what the aftermath of that is really abandonment. There's whole communities that lose the larger portion of their economic base. And what's left behind, they don't control. They're, as Claire Kellaway said, they're price takers. And so, yeah, I think it's huge. I think people perceive that, and I think they're pissed off about it. I'm not sure that they're always blaming the right people for it, but they're highly aware of it for sure.
Here's a comment in the chat here, and a reminder that we are at 8 o'clock. So if you want to ask some of these questions in that Padlet that I posted, you're welcome to. It says, the irony, so many immigrant families can relate to that. In fact, we have left our own families and homes too. But how do we come to foster that there's more shared experience between rural and urban working class folks than we often acknowledge?
That's a great question. I mean, it really underscores the role of our political leaders here, right? Because it's not necessarily the case that these divides are front and center. You know, a different kind of rhetoric could be used, one that helps us see our common cause and our common conditions. I don't know. I mean, and I mean that like sincerely. I'm assuming that question is a big driver of why a lot of you logged on tonight. So, Anthony.
Yeah, and I'll only say that while I have no answers, the trajectory of this series is towards trying to figure those very things out as we move through. It's really essential to get to the how we got here piece, which is what we're doing tonight and next week, but then we'll begin to move towards, okay, what can we do to change this trajectory in a significant way? And it's certainly partly about language, but it's also about much more than language, about how we interact, about our economic and other policies. So that is the trajectory. So if you're able with it, we'll move into discussion of things like that. How do we find commonalities and build on them?
Thanks, Anthony. I'm scrolling through here. There's some great comments as well, just validating some of the things that people are saying. So that might be part of the answer, is acknowledging those connections and those shared experiences. Yeah, I'm just scrolling down to try to capture, because there's a lot rolling in here towards the end.
I also see Erica's point about hands across the hills, and great point, and to recognize that there are so many people trying to bridge the rural versus urban divide around the country, right? So that's, I mean, maybe that's what it takes, right? A lot of grassroots efforts of people in their backyards trying to figure out how to connect.
So I was a little skeptical about the Padlet when Oliver told me about it because I'm such a Luddite, but I see so many questions and we really have to wrap up, that I would really encourage people to cut and paste questions or comments into the Padlet. Certainly not only next week, but going forward throughout the series, we'll do our best to respond to or integrate the questions and comments. Certainly won't be able to do it with all of them, but I think it would be terrific if we'll save the chat box, and we'll have two, but it'd be great if people would put those questions into the Padlet or your comments as well. Some really good insights in here.
Yeah, and something that I'd like to maybe capture in the future, Anthony, there's lots of resources being shared in the chat, as well as there's been some great resources from you and so it might be nice to capture that in some way moving forward as well.
Can you drop the link for the Padlet one more time, Oliver?
Yep, will do.
Okay. So maybe I can wrap us up. First of all, thank you to all of you for coming and giving us a little over an hour of your time tonight. That's terrific. It's just the beginning of the conversation, the first of four. Special thanks to Kathy for her wonderful presentation. Read her book. Her book is absolutely worth the read. It's full of insights. And I was delighted when I read it and reached out to her, and she was willing to work with us on this effort. And then I'll just remind you again that going forward, we've got 3 more sessions with one more fully focused on the problem, how we got here, the causes, but the final 2 moving us towards solutions, steps, things we can do. So I hope you'll stick with it. If you know folks who you think would be really interested in this and they were unable to be here tonight, we can make the recording available. Kelly, maybe you could chime in, or Oliver, about exactly how that would happen, but we ask that somebody would listen to the recording, at least of the presentations, preferably the whole thing, joining, so they're not kind of in a different lane. How will that happen if somebody that wants to join?
Yeah, so in the links that I just dropped, one of them's Padlet, the other one is a help video if you're uncomfortable with the Padlet, and that's on our YouTube channel. So Future Generation University's YouTube channel, that's where the recordings will be hosted. And then Kelly also just dropped in the chat the link to register. So if people are new and want to register, that link is also available in the chat. You can just send that to them as well, and they'll be able to get some of the emails you all have been getting.
That's great. And when they that link, then they would have access to the recording. Is that what you're saying?
Yep. Yeah, we'll send that.
Okay.
Kelly also mentioned earlier that we were going to try to collect your notes, Anthony and Kathy, on this session, and potentially send that to everybody part of the webinar as well. That way you could review those at that time.
Great. And check out the 3 sponsoring organizations, all of them really important organizations doing work to build better communities across the country, but primarily rural, all urban as well, all around the world. Future Generations has a terrific master's program, a certificate program that you or others might be interested in, that's grounded in effective community development. Appalachian Voices is tearing it up in Southwest Virginia and Central Appalachia, trying to help the new economy. And Lichen is doing terrific work connecting both the kind of academic resources of the region with folks on the ground. So all 3 of those groups are of interest and things you might want to get involved with. So should we bid everybody good night and see you next week?
Yes, thank you, everybody. And I'll drop our YouTube channel in there as well. So that's Future Generation University's YouTube channel. That's where it'll be, but we'll follow an email to the link of the recording as well.
Great. Thank you.